Star Wars has loved bringing characters back from presumed death for decades now. Sometimes it's a minor character whose presumed death just kind of gets papered over, going from one bit of media to the next. Sometimes it's just a gratuitous fake-out, and sometimes it's a major plot point that they were dead and now somehow are not. Today I'm going to go through some of the biggest characters who died and got better and rank them all in two different ways. The first way is just how dead they actually were, and the second is how I feel about the return. I'm only going to count bodies actually existing again, so for Sith spirits like Mark Aragnos who try to come back but don't quite make it into a corpse, you're not making the cut. Try again next year. Obviously the creation of this video at this point is inspired by the Maul Shadowlord show, but we're going to start somewhere a little lower stakes with a Jedi named Kakru. He was introduced in a comic called Acts of War, but when he appeared in the original Clone Wars animated series, he was seemingly killed by Grievous, who collects his lightsaber, and then the rescue mission for the other Jedi leaves him for dead. He later returned and even went on to become one of the most important comic characters in Star Wars Legends. He was in the Clone Wars era comics, but he was also a central figure in the Dark Times comics as a survivor of Order 66, leading a group of Padawans, and then he was a member of the Jedi Council after Luke's presumed death, finally becoming one of the 3 leading members of the Reborn Galactic Alliance. So he's going to get a C as far as dead characters go. I'm giving lower scores for anyone who seemed to be intended to come back when their death was written, but this isn't the case with Kakru. Higher ranks are more definitely dead. There was a post from Holocron keeper Li Lin-Chi that he was presumed dead, and it turned out this was just a trance Whipped can do, which you'd think the other Jedi might know about and not leave him behind, but the thing which makes this less egregious for me is that he's kind of just a side character when he dies in the episode, so it's easy to just not even notice. We don't really know what state his body's in. I'm fine with him being one of the less dead people who are dead. His comeback is a little bit more complicated to me. Ultimately, him coming back is just the comics ignoring what the show did, but even within his comic stories, the death leaves some kind of unsatisfying loose ends, partially because of the end of the publishing of Legends, but he's also a very powerful Jedi Master running essentially his own Jedi Academy at the time that Luke would have also been seeking out former Jedi. And we get through the entire Yuuzhan Vong War with no mention of him, and Legacy never even really attempts to clear up when he would have joined Luke, or whether he was involved in the Yuuzhan Vong War at all, despite the Legacy comics otherwise being fairly willing to follow up on NJO content. So ultimately, Kakru's story after his death brings it to a B for me. There are some gaps, but those gaps kind of exist independently of him being formerly dead. For Maul, I think his actual death has to be an A. Sure, we don't see him lifelessly hit the floor instead of dragging himself off of Naboo, but the guy's pretty dead, and everything points to him being pretty dead. For his return, I ultimately think he becomes a far more interesting character for it. And I think Maul has a net positive impact on stories that he's in afterwards. They also deal explicitly within the stories with the fact that he was supposed to have been dead. He has his mechanical legs, but they also never really treat it as bringing him back from death, so the denial that he actually died at some point, I think brings it down a little bit for me. I honestly would have probably preferred it if they just said, oh yeah, he was dead and then the Night Sister magic brought him back to life. But your mileage may vary there. One interesting thing with Maul, though, is that his return in the Clone Wars cartoon wasn't the first time he was brought back to life, and it wasn't even the second time. 2 years after the Phantom Menace release, Star Wars Tales 9 aimed to answer the important question, wouldn't it be cool if Vader fought Maul? Vader goes to a moon in the Dromund-Kaas system and ends up in a fight with a resurrected Maul, who was brought back allegedly by some dark side adepts who wanted to replace Vader in Palpatine's service with this new Maul. The comic has the Infinities label inside it, meaning it would typically not be considered canon, but Li Lin-Chi also confirmed that its events were considered canon within the Holocron. If you really wanted to retcon all of this, you could still paint their statements to Vader as being slightly misleading, and have this be the end of Maul's story after his resurrection in the Clone Wars. The Adepts never really give a timeline. It doesn't look like Maul has fake legs, but he's wearing pants, so who can really tell? The second non-canon return of Maul was in the Star Wars Visionaries comic, where he was killed on Tatooine in a duel with Obi-Wan, much like the canon Maul in Rebels, with his mechanical legs, though in Visionaries he gets shot by Owen Lars during that duel. Ultimately for me, the Maul story in canon ends up being more cohesive than in Legends, so I'm going to give the Legends return a C and the canon return an A. The fact that he's brought back so much really shows that people felt like he was an underexplored character after Episode 1, so don't hate that we got that opportunity to explore him more and see him as this sort of spurned Sith. The next character we're going to talk about is possibly cheating a bit. It's General Grievous. When he dies in Revenge of the Sith, he is definitely super dead. His insides burn up, he's not Force sensitive, so there's no ghost shenanigans, and he even gets a finishing move quip from Obi-Wan. If there's ever an S ranking for being definitely dead, it's Grievous. But in Star Wars Galaxies, his body gets used to make a droid called NK Necrosis. You can say that's not really Grievous coming back to life, but I said the Sith don't count because they don't get a body, whereas this is definitively still a body that had belonged to Grievous coming back to some version of life. I also frankly think this is just a cool idea, and on my gaming channel we once did a tabletop RPG campaign where NK Necrosis was the big bad, building up a droid army on Mustafar, so I have a bit of a soft spot for it. It's also a resurrection which avoids the problems people generally have with resurrections, since he's not actually back alive, it's just a droid using his body. So NK Necrosis gets an S. Then we have Shaak-Ti. Shaak-Ti is a little bit more confusing since she dies so many times, but it's usually in cut content, so those don't actually count. When her deaths do make it into finished material, it's usually in the form of visions, which aren't necessarily reflections of reality. So despite the sheer volume of Shaak-Ti deaths, her death only gets a D for me. I think she's one of the easiest characters to say didn't actually die before she returned from death. Her return in The Force Unleashed in Legends therefore has less working against it as well, which is an easy way to push it up the rankings. I think the art department of that game went a little too far for the wardrobe, but in terms of her being a Jedi Council member, surviving that far into the Empire, I have no real complaints. I don't think it puts an extra hole in stories like Kakru does, but I also don't think it sparks joy like the basic idea of NK Necrosis does for me. It doesn't add a ton to her character like Maul either. Or even really Kakru. I think it's a much more utilitarian thing to just have this character you fight in The Force Unleashed, so I think that puts her return at a B, which is really helped by the fact that her death is so ambiguous. If she had a more direct death, this would probably end up being a C or even a D. Aurra Sing also theoretically dies, according to the Jedi, in a crash on Slave One during the Clone Wars in the episode Lethal Trackdown. She'd already been appearing in the Legacy of the Force novel set 60 years later, 4 years before this episode occurred. But the reason she's believed to have died is the explosion of Slave One, which we already know exists later in the original trilogy, so it's not like that's even side media that the show might have ignored. That alone means that death gets a pretty low ranking from me. We don't see a body, we have her explode in a ship that we know still exists afterwards. So the death is probably a C at worst, and her return the next season is in my mind absolutely fine. I'm going to put her at a B because it's kind of similar to the Shaak-Ti situation there, although more happens with the character after her supposed death. So I think it's a quote-unquote death that doesn't raise a lot of questions, and a return that actually gets explained and makes the character better anyways. The most famous example to come back to life in both continuities is almost certainly Palpatine. His deaths I'm going to give an S. He exploded in a big reactor flash. The body does not exist. He's gone. He comes back in a fairly similar way in both Legends and Canon with a mix of essence transfers and clone bodies. People mean on the somehow Palpatine returned line in Rise of Skywalker, but obviously Poe wouldn't know, and the movie frankly deals with it enough that I think as an audience you can have a general idea of what's going on. In both cases, I think Palpatine coming back as a plot to follow makes sense. And no, I don't think this ruins Anakin's sacrifice, because his sacrifice was to save Luke in that moment, and he does that. In Dark Empire, Palpatine hints that Endor wasn't Palpatine's first death even in Legends. On the canon side, I'm not a big fan of Rise of Skywalker as a whole, but none of that has to do with the idea of Palpatine coming back. I thought that was a perfectly fine, good part of the movie. And I think his Force Storm is a cool visual element as well. Palpatine taking over the galaxy as one of the most powerful dark side Force users in history, and spending a ton of galactic resources on making sure he wouldn't just immediately die, is a fun storyline as far as I'm concerned, and it makes a lot of sense. So both returns in this situation get an S from me. Again, this is not necessarily a review of the media including them in either the case of Dark Empire or of The Rise of Skywalker, but the returns themselves, I honestly really don't have an issue with it, and I think it makes a lot of sense for the character. Just as a quick one on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Grand Inquisitor in Kenobi. His quote-unquote death is probably a B, since I can't quite put it on the same level of Maul being cut in half or Palpatine exploding, but the whole thing which makes it worse is this shot here, where he's shown on the ground with his eyes wide open. If it wasn't for this shot, he doesn't really seem like he necessarily needs to die from the wound that Reva gives him. If he'd just been stabbed by Reva and then Reva runs away, then he turns up and says, "Oh, surprise, I'm fine," I honestly wouldn't consider it that much of a problem, like Sabine and Ahsoka. I'm fine with that as well. So for that, I think I have to give the Grand Inquisitor's return an F. We already knew the character didn't die because he's in Rebels, and I just feel like this was one of the cheaper fake outs that you could do. The original surprise I got better of Star Wars is, of course, Boba Fett. I'm going to, perhaps controversially, give his death an F. We hear 3PO explicitly say the Sarlacc should like this video and subscribe for more, but it also doesn't work fast with its digestion, and Boba is covered in armor while being armed to the teeth. This is like the easiest thing to say doesn't actually kill someone. If Boba was more of a main character in the movie, I could easily see them just focusing on him getting out right afterwards. So with that in mind, his return gets an A. There's been interesting stuff done with his character in both continuities, and combining that with the nature of his apparent death, I think his return makes total sense. Rumors of his demise have been greatly exaggerated. The final character I want to talk about is Ventress. Ventress dies in Dark Disciple in Canon and in the Obsession comics in Legends. Obsession in Legends deals with both her apparent death and resurrection within a few pages. Obi-Wan and Anakin believe they've killed her, they transport her to Coruscant for a funeral, but she reveals on the way back that she was in a Sith trance and commandeers the medical frigate carrying her, aiming to disappear into the galaxy. This is complicated a bit by the fact that other media is set after this in the Clone Wars, and she continues to show up, both in the Clone Wars cartoon and in the novels. I'm not really going to try to rank the legend side of this one. In canon, Ventress dies in Dark Disciple based on unproduced scripts from the Clone Wars, and then she turns back up in the Bad Batch with little explanation, and then finally in Tales of the Underworld where she does get an explanation for her return. I think her death in canon gets an A. She's pretty clearly dead. However, even before Tales of the Underworld, I was pretty adamant that her death wasn't meant to be permanent. We knew there was some life and death elements to Night Sister magic, and when Dark Disciple ends, Quinlan Vos and Obi-Wan lower her into the waters on Dathomir, and it starts doing magical stuff. So I think the idea that she could return was kind of baked into her send-off, or at least the possible means for it. And in a world where we're not just writing every return from death as an F automatically, which would really undermine the point of this video, I think the character development afterwards and the context of her death makes it one of the better ones, so I'm actually going to give it an A. I'm also just generally a Ventress fan, so there's some bias there. Either way, that's going to do it for today's video. Let me know what you think of each of these deaths in the comments, or if there's another character death and resurrection that you would like to give a ranking to. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.